In today's video, thanks to the great fellas over at Pallet, I've actually managed to get a hold of the brand new RTX 3050, where today we find out just how good is a budget graphics card in 2022. Now this right here is the Pallet RTX 3050 8GB, a graphics card that I was sent to take a comprehensive look at after Pallet got in touch with me over on Twitter of all things. After a few emails back and forth to explain my ideas for a video, they were more than happy to send me this sample over, and to really put it through its paces from a budget perspective. Now I'll start off by saying that this Pallet variant is an absolutely tiny card. The amount of hardware packed onto this PCB is genuinely very impressive, and I've had Pallet cards dating back to the Frobot the Robot branded 8600 GTS, so the quality is still there a decade on. Admittedly, they no longer have Frobot the Robot on the box, but that's a minor criticism. Either way, what exactly does £250 of graphics card buy you spec-wise today? Released just this year in 2022, Nvidia's RTX 3050 serves to be the first and the main budget RTX offering, filling a budget segment that was previously held by the likes of the GTX 750 Ti or GTX 1050 Ti. So that way it's actually got some rather big boots to fill, as they were around the £100 mark or below, and this is slightly over double that. Considering a lot of us budget users out there are probably still using those exact cards, it's going to be interesting to see how this fares, and it is rather spec-packed. Based on the Ampere architecture, it operates on the tiny 8nm process with 2560 CUDA cores, 8GB of GDDR6 memory, 80 tensor cores and 20 ray tracing cores. So it certainly is as packed as I said. Using around 120 watts full load with only a single 8-pin power connector, it certainly is a very compact little unit. But then again, the 50 series always has been. My only concern with it is the little 128-bit memory bus, but you know, it's a budget card, it's gonna have that. And of course, the price. £250, as I just mentioned, is around double what entry-level graphics cards used to be. And although this is a rather spec and feature-packed card, it really does show a stark increase in what these entry-level cards are currently costing. But even at this amount, I did find the results really surprising. Now, I have got plenty of benchmarks on this little card, from the latest and greatest 2020 onwards titles in the new benchmark suite, and I've also gone through my classic benchmark suite to actually go through and see some of those older titles we want to see tested from a compatibility and performance perspective. Because, you know, there's lots of cards to compare this to and lots of games to test. To give you some perspective for those of us looking to upgrade, or whether or not this might compel you to buy new, there's a lot of areas that we need to touch on as a budget card, because this could serve as an upgrade for those of us with older cards. I myself am using an R9 Fury from now 7 years ago, and you know, we want to see if this card is good enough to compete against those old high-end cards and offer us an upgrade for the first time in years. So I've actually gone through, I've got the benchmarks all done with the launch drivers and a clean install of them. For the first time in years, it's ready to find out, is a budget graphics card enough to topple Budget Build's own R9 Fury? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that is going to have to be in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks today, we're right into it with Red Dead Redemption 2, which opted to use the same high settings as my R9 Fury. Performance was very impressive at 1080p, with the game often hovering just over 60 FPS and often at times a little bit higher than that, with stellar visual quality. Given how well the card handled itself at 1080p though, I thought, you know what, let's try and boost it up to 1440p, as this is a 250 quid card, remember, which actually did see quite a stark decrease in performance, most likely due to it only having a 128 megabit bus. It was still playable, but it just felt like it was a tad juddery at times. However, the saving grace of this card, and my first real foray into the world of DLSS, meant that with the balanced settings in 1440p with DLSS, we could actually claw back that 1080p performance with the visuals of 1440p. Now, there was a little bit of visual degradation on areas like the rain and small fine details, but the card itself can run higher than 1080p thanks to the technology, saying that could be a real game changer as we carry on with the graphics card's benchmarks. Following on from this, we had BeamNG, which a lot of people often ask me to test, especially on these now entry-level graphics cards. I started benchmarking in 1080p, as that is where the card's target resolution lies, and performance was very, very impressive, especially in the heavier maps where a lot of usual cards can suffer and struggle. The performance usually hovered just over 60 FPS once again, and even increased well over this in less detailed areas. Given the card's price point though, I did think it was fair to try and push it to 1440p here, as we have no aid from DLSS and gives a good idea of the performance you'll see in those indie titles that don't have Nvidia's dedicated DLSS support. Once again though, with raw 1440p and no DLSS, it was definitely a relatively steep decrease in performance. However, it did remain fully playable, although I did notice quite a bit of pop-in. Hopefully just these being down to release drivers and the small memory bit bus, but it was quite noticeable at this resolution. Now, my first real experience with RTX here, and the first one on this benchmark suite, with Minecraft RTX, which actually involved me buying Minecraft for a third time. I know, that was actually quite painful to do. Albeit a confusing experience to set up, the game looked absolutely gorgeous with perfect lighting and performance that worked alright considering this is just Minecraft. There were frame drops, and this is a very RTX heavy game, so that was to be expected, given that this is a entry-level RTX card, and I think the lowest end RTX card we've actually seen. So Minecraft in all its forms will work absolutely fine in 1080p, just if you're using the Java version, you can run this game safely in 1440p or 4K. Just don't go trying to do that with ray tracing enabled in this version of the game. It seems so strange to be testing all these new titles here, but Forza Horizon 5 defaulted to some odd settings with middling to low options, which I definitely didn't expect, given that I know this game can run absolutely fine on older cards with higher settings. So I'm going to assume that for those of you going into this with this card, if the drivers are still in the same state they are now, you're going to have to configure a few of these games, as they seem to opt for lower settings generally than what's required. I quickly found that 1440p with high settings allowed the card to see 100% utilization and push its way well onto the 60 FPS mark while looking pretty great. This was with the RTX elements turned on, but I don't think they're visible in general gameplay, they're more for car previews. Still, it looked great, albeit I did notice that pop-in again, but this time it remained at every resolution and was far more noticeable than on my old R9 card. Once again, could be drivers, could be down to that small 128-bit memory bus. Time for a first with Halo Infinite actually being fully playable on the channel, because usually it hates older graphics cards, so it's actually quite nice to see a card with brand new release day drivers actually running through the game with no issues. We used high settings 1440p resolution and there were no issues here. 1080p could offer you just a few more frames, but generally it was only about 3 to 5 extra frames, so I felt 1440p just gave you that visual edge for hardly any performance hits. Very impressive for a tiny card, and probably the first showing I've seen where I've actually been like, wow, for an entry-level brand new graphics card on release day, it is running the latest and greatest things absolutely fine. Bannerlord defaulted to the same settings as my usual R9 Fury, something that I've said a lot already in this video, and it did in fact run ever so slightly better than that aged flagship, with great settings and a great frame rate, and it was actually more consistent than my old R9 Fury too, albeit at the cost of pop-in. I'm really hoping this is a driver-related issue, but it seems to be across a few games here. It does seem to be pretty bad. It's not terrible, it's not the worst I've ever seen, but definitely something that persists even when testing on other systems. I'm really hoping it's driver related so this can be resolved, but there was quite a lot of pop-in regardless of setting or resolution or system I tested in. Crysis Remastered ran initially with 1080p high settings and ray tracing enabled on the performance setting. Once again though, things were very smooth and the game looked absolutely stunning with its lighting fidelity. I spent most of my time just destroying huts and watching the light just pour in from the surrounding buildings. And I will be very honest, I do love that ray tracing technology, it is absolutely brilliant. On the other side though, without ray tracing, you are able to push 1440p with these settings, but no ray tracing. The frame pacing though goes out the window for some reason in Crysis, with the game bouncing anywhere between 30 and 60 FPS. Once again though, you will need DLSS to come to the rescue, which helped the game look brilliant, but you do have that sort of idea that there is a little bit of shimmering in Crysis with DLSS, not too bad, but you can notice it if you really look. Honestly, I'd opt for 1080p with the ray tracing with this type of card, as it's a bit of a shame to see that not able to push those higher resolutions. Unless you, of course, you don't mind using DLSS, because it is a bit of a lifesaver. Then finally, to round off the new benchmark suite, we have Battlefield 5. I opted to test the multiplayer, as I didn't really notice a great deal of performance difference between single or multiplayer from a little bit of testing I did earlier before this benchmark, and in 1080p with ray tracing enabled and high settings with no anti-aliasing, we were able to eke out a frame rate just over 60 FPS the majority of the time. Once again though, you can opt to forsake the ray tracing and opt for a 1440p resolution if you'd prefer that extra bit of visual clarity. This was the first title, though, that didn't really need DLSS to carry it, so usually you do have that choice between ray tracing or 1440p. Unless of course you have DLSS, in which case sometimes you can eke out both, but it depends on how well that chosen game deals with those DLSS artifacts. Personally, most of the time I couldn't see them and I thought it looked absolutely brilliant with DLSS on, but once again it does depend on your chosen title. Now those benchmarks were mighty impressive, and the performance is definitely more than adequate for 1080p gaming with high or ultra settings and ray tracing. 1440p though does suffer without the use of DLSS unless the title is very optimised, but that truly is a game changer, that DLSS, allowing these budget entry cards to manage 1440p and 4K gaming. But that's not really what this segment's ever aimed for. This segment is always reserved for 1080p high settings gaming at an entry level. But hey, my HD 7770 was a £70 card 10 years ago, and that could manage 1080p gaming for years after release, so I'd expect this to be a tad better. But is it better than the competition? Well, when comparing titles like Red Dead Redemption 2, we can see this card often finds itself with similar 1080p performance to that of an old R9 390 or R9 Fury. Even the GTX 1060 and RX 470 are often comparable and can see themselves pulling slightly ahead in 1440p onwards, but in 1080p they are all relatively equal. Though, of course, DLSS can carry things, whereas these older cards, well, they can't really do things like that. Another good example are titles like Halo Infinite, where it does benefit from the dedicated brand new driver support, something that's been dropped from far too many recently released cards, mainly on the AMD side admittedly, so it is quite nice to actually see these brand new games running perfectly fine on this new card, but suffering on the older cards that are otherwise pretty comparable in terms of specs. So it is nice to have that driver support for years to come, something that Nvidia has been pretty good at, and something that I'm actually going to criticise AMD for here, completely abandoning cards that aren't even that old. In general though, the same continues on for most titles in 1080p, usually showing the GTX 3050 slightly ahead, with 1440p being adequate, but slightly behind those older higher end offerings that a lot of us will have had. Unless of course DLSS was utilised, where of course it shows it can pull itself ahead thanks to that technology, and that is brilliant. It's a great selling point and is definitely a point the card has going for it. In general though, it does show that for those of you on a 750 Ti or equivalent card, could greatly benefit from using an RTX 3050 as an upgrade path. In general though, I found performance was near one-on-one with my old AMD Fury, so those of us from a high-end perspective, well, what we're mainly getting from this are things like RTX, and as I said quite a lot now, DLSS, which definitely offers performance without degrading visual quality a noticeable amount. A lot of the time I couldn't even tell I was using DLSS, that's how good the technology was. Most games default to the same settings as my Fury, so you get the same performance and settings as someone using a high-end card from about 5 or 6 years ago, but you do get it in a tiny package, and it is brilliant having all those years of support ahead. Just remember that for those newer titles where you don't have DLSS, well, you're going to be stuck with 1080p, and things are only going to get more intensive from here as the years go on. For older titles though, well, I've gone through and I've tested some of the classics just to see how the RTX 3050 handled with those games we're already pretty familiar with and pretty comfortable playing, because we're going to still want to play them years after they've come out, so it's worth testing how they do on the 3050 in the classic benchmark suite. Now we've gone through the up-to-date 2022 benchmarks, but for those of you here for the classics, well, it makes sense to see how it fares in those titles, and to see what compatibility is like for those titles. So to start us off with, we've got GTA 5, which I set to the ultra settings in 1440p, and well, the game and the performance speaks for itself. Looked great, ran great. The only really compatibility of note was there was that slight pop-in issue still. It was nowhere near as bad as those newer titles, but still, something that does still seem to crop up even in these older titles. Fable: The Lost Chapters and Fable Anniversary both ran absolutely brilliantly. There are the same Nvidia compatibility issues that have plagued these games for years, where sometimes in the load zones to the next area you can see little black squares being actually visible on the little gates that go over them. Only a minor gripe, but something that's actually happened for years with Nvidia cards, and something that's never been fixed, probably because they're too new and this game's too old. Either way, it doesn't happen on my R9 Fury, so I can give my old card a win, but other than that they both ran exceptionally well on whatever variant you want to run. Sims 4 ran with no issues whatsoever, completely maxed out. Don't really often have any issues with this game given it runs on old DirectX 9 graphics cards, but you guys always want to hear how it runs, and I can pleasantly confirm that those of you getting an RTX 3050 can probably even push 4K and beyond in this game with no issues whatsoever. CSGO ran perfectly fine in and out of the benchmark mode, and can throw itself up against casual, competitive, deathmatch, any mode you think of, and you'll often find yourself more limited by your processor. So for CSGO, definitely not a bad shout, but then again, neither about any of the decent cards from the last 6 years. Then finally, to make sure you can run all of the 100% bug-free and perfectly designed Bethesda titles with no issues, I tried to test Fallout 4, which ran perfectly fine. So other Bethesda games will run perfectly fine within reason, such as Skyrim Remastered, Oblivion or anything older around those age, and you shouldn't have any issues whatsoever with performance. With the usual Bethesda stuff though, you might run into issues with the game itself. So with all those benchmarks out of the way, and trust me they took a long time to do, there's a few final points to discuss. In terms of NVENC quality, which is the onboard encoder, so it lets you record things that are going on screen, I decided to give it a quick test. I set up the Xbox 360 and fed in a digital signal to give it its best chance it has, and I gave Fable a quick speed run for the first time in about a year now. And the best way to test this is often real-world usage, so I decided to stream this test to Twitch with a 6 megabit per second upload and the high-quality NVENC preset. And it looked absolutely brilliant, and I dare say on par with my 3700X, with the GPU definitely having plenty more to give in these instances. I did find it a tad slower for productivity than my older R9 Fury, but that thing is a computational beast when it comes to other cards, so it's a little bit of an unfair comparison. Either way, it has full handbrake support, but I often use my CPU for this regardless, and it does have full support for editing in most applications, so I actually edited this entire video on the RTX 3050, and I was pleasantly surprised. It did a really nice job. Following on from this though, we have DLSS and RTX. They certainly present themselves as very compelling technologies, and time will tell how well DLSS helps this card in future titles. Should 1080p gaming ever become a struggle, usually you have to opt for lower resolutions on these entry-level cards, but with the look of DLSS, maybe you won't have to. RTX also looks absolutely gorgeous, but being entry level, it is already struggling with some of the earlier ray trace games at 1080p, but then again, you do have DLSS there, and you could mix and match the two to try and run ray tracing and DLSS at the same time and have a dabble around with that, but then again, you aren't going to be running the game at maximum resolution with the highest quality ray tracing settings, especially as this technology becomes more adopted and harder to run. Finally, we do have the temperatures and power usage and the quality of the card, and I can safely assure you that Palette have done a brilliant job here, and if you are going to get an RTX 3050 and want to choose a variant, just go ahead and get a Palette one if you can. They're brilliant cards, it's absolutely tiny form factor, and it only peaked out on 123 watts under full usage. It hardly uses any power, even at max usage. It's a brilliant little card, and I don't even think I heard it rev up once during my testing. The form factor and general design are very sleek, and if you do need to look out for variants, well, once again, I could definitely say this Palette card is a very good choice. So in conclusion, a brand new graphics card featured on budget builds, and where do my thoughts lie from a budget perspective? Well, it is a tough one. Most used cards that have been in this competing performance range retail for about close to the RTX 3050's RRP. However, to see a 50 series card being over the £200 mark when I'm used to seeing them just a tad over £100 is a genuinely concerning factor. However, nowadays, features are worth near as much as performance, and to see things like DLSS and RTX offer you ray tracing and high resolution gaming on a bottom tier card it is very nice. New NVENC is also extremely nice from a creating standpoint, especially if you're into streaming. So my verdict, if you can find one at RRP and you are looking for a brand new card, I don't think it's a bad card. I think it's a very nice card, and I do hope the prices do drop down from that £250 RRP, as personally, even with these features, I think it's a little bit too high. I'd feel more comfortable paying sub £200 for this card, but £250, it's not bad. My issues are recommending them it's just hard to make my mind up. About 6 years ago, I bought my R9 Fury for £150 as an X-Displaying model, and I'm getting roughly the same performance, admittedly with more features, for £100 more 6 years later. It just doesn't seem worth it from that perspective, but we're not in that market anymore, and it hurts me to say this. R9 Furies do sell for £100 more than I bought it for. So I can't use the price I bought it for 6 years ago because it's not relevant. I hope prices do go back down to what they were, but as it stands, if you ask me to choose between the R9 Fury at £250 used, or the RTX 3050 at £250 brand new, well, for the first time since a GeForce 2MX 400, I have to say that Nvidia's actually got my money here. I've adored my time with the card and I'm eager to get some more coverage of it out there, and it has been a real eye-opener to the world of budget graphics cards today. This video has been a lot of work, I've had to put a lot of research and effort into benchmarking, so I do hope you've all enjoyed it and found it very helpful if you're looking at buying an RTX card. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.